The wind came from the north that evening, carrying the kind of cold that doesn't ask permission. It settled into the stones of Valethorn, like something alive, pressing against the shuttered windows of the merchant quarter, rattling the iron signs that hung above the locked shops. Snow had been falling since midday, thick and relentless, and by the time the last traders closed their stalls in the Grand Exchange, the streets had turned into corridors of white silence. Varon Ashcroft pulled the collar of his coat higher and cursed under his breath. His horse had thrown a shoe 3 blocks back, and his stable boy was somewhere on the other side of the city, unreachable, useless. The farrier on Kestrel Lane had already closed. The one on Bridgewell was too far in the wrong direction, which left Varon standing at the edge of the merchant quarter, with a limping mare and a decision he did not want to make. The Greyward. The Orc Quarter sat on the other side of the Kettle Bridge, a stretch of low buildings and narrow alleys that most humans in Valethorn pretended didn't exist. Varon had lived in this city for 19 years, built a trade network that stretched from the coastal ports to the mountain passes, and he could count on one hand the number of times he'd crossed that bridge. There was a farrier in the Greyward, Orc-run, but competent. His trade partner, Aldous, had mentioned it once reluctantly, as if admitting that an orc could shoe a horse properly was some kind of concession. Varon looked at his mare, looked at the bridge, looked at the snow thickening in the air like flour sifting from a torn sack. He walked. The Kettle Bridge was short, maybe 40 paces, but the world changed on the other side. The cobblestones gave way to packed dirt, frozen, solid, and treacherous. The buildings were older here, timber and daub instead of the merchant quarter's dressed stone, and the street lamps were fewer and dimmer. Their oil running low, smoke rose from chimneys in thin gray lines. Somewhere a dog barked, then went quiet. The smell was different. Wood smoke and tallow and something herbal, sharp and unfamiliar, like crushed pine mixed with something darker. Varon kept his head down and walked. He wasn't afraid, exactly. He was a large man, 41 years old, broad across the shoulders from years of loading cargo before he could afford to pay others to do it. He carried a knife on his belt, out of habit, more than necessity. But the Greyward made him aware of himself in a way that the merchant quarter never did. Here, his wool coat and leather boots marked him. His clean-shaven face marked him. The silver clasp on his collar marked him. He was not just a man walking through snow. He was a human walking through an orc neighborhood, and every window he passed was a pair of eyes that noticed. The farrier's shop was dark closed. A sign in growth of felt hung on the door. Varon couldn't read it, but the meaning was clear enough. He stood there, snow accumulating on his shoulders, his mare shifting her weight off the bad hoof, and he realized he was stranded. Not dangerously, not desperately, but inconveniently and thoroughly stranded in a part of the city where he had no contacts, no bearings, and no particular desire to linger. That's when he heard the voice. Sir, almost swallowed by the wind. Varon turned. A girl stood at the corner of the farrier's building, half hidden by a stack of iron barrels. She was orc, unmistakably. Green-gray skin, slightly darker at the cheekbones. Small tusks, barely more than nubs, pushing at her lower lip. Her hair was black and thick, pulled into a braid that had come partly undone, loose strands, stiff with frost. She wore a coat that was too large for her, the sleeves rolled up to free her hands, and beneath it something dark. A wool dress maybe, patched at the hem. A cloth bag hung from one shoulder pressed against her body, as if it contained something she was afraid to lose. She was maybe 6 years old, maybe 7, and she was alone. Varon looked past her, expecting a parent, an older sibling, anyone. The street was empty. Snow fell between them like a curtain being drawn. Sir, the girl said again, and this time he heard the crack in her voice, the fracture running through that single syllable. She had been saying it for a while, he realized, to other people, people who had kept walking. Are you all right? Varon asked. He didn't crouch down, he didn't step closer. He was a human man in the Greyward, and approaching an orc child uninvited carried implications he understood even if he couldn't articulate them. The girl studied him. Her eyes were amber, large in her thin face, and they moved across him with an intelligence that seemed too old for her body. She was reading him the way a merchant reads a contract, looking for the trap. "You're human," she said. "I am," my mother said. "If I ever needed help and no orc was near, I should find a human with still hands." She said the dangerous ones always move their hands. They were at his sides, motionless, holding the mare's lead and nothing else. He almost smiled, but the look on the girl's face stopped him. This was not a moment for smiling. "Your mother sounds wise. What's your name?" "Rin." "Rin Goreclaw." "I'm Varen. What are you doing out here alone, Rin?" "It's freezing." "I know it's freezing," she said it with a flicker of irritation, as if cold were a personal insult she'd been enduring for hours. Then the irritation collapsed, and what was underneath was worse. Her chin trembled. Her hands tightened on the strap of her bag. "My mother didn't come home last night." The words landed in the space between them, and sat there, heavy and wrong. Varen felt the weight of them settle into his chest, not the dramatic, theatrical weight of a man performing concern, but the real physical tightness that comes when a child tells you something that no child should have to say. "Last night," he repeated. "She works for the human lord, Lord Crow, at his estate. She's a healer. She tends to his household. She goes in the morning and comes back before dark. Always. Every day. But yesterday, she didn't come back." Rin's voice was steady now, the steadiness of a child who has rehearsed the speech in her head, who has practiced it against the silence of an empty apartment, who has said it to her own reflection to make sure the words come out right. Mrs. Hethka next door said she probably just had to stay late, but she didn't come home this morning either. And Mrs. Hethka had to leave for the tannery. She said, "I should go to school." "Did you go to school?" Rin looked away, the first crack in her composure. "There's no school for me anymore." Varen waited. He'd learned long ago that silence held properly pulls more truth from people than questions do. "They said I couldn't come back 3 weeks ago. The headmaster said there were too many orc students and not enough seats. He said I could reapply in the spring." She looked back at Varen with those amber eyes. "But there were empty seats. I saw them. He just didn't want us there." Varen said nothing. He didn't know what to say. He'd sat on the Merchant Guild Council for 7 years. He'd voted on trade tariffs, import quotas, labor contracts. Had he ever voted on anything related to orc schools? He couldn't remember. The thought sat in his stomach like something undigested. "So you've been alone since this morning," he said. "Since last night, Mrs. Hethka came over and slept on the chair, but she left early. I've been walking since then, looking for someone who might know where Mother went." "Have you asked anyone?" "I asked Mr. Davith at the smokehouse. He said he doesn't keep track of every orc woman in the Greyward. I asked the old woman who sells candles on Fisher Street. She said, my mother probably ran off with some human and I should get used to it." Rin's voice didn't waver when she said this. She reported it the way a soldier reports casualties, flatly, because feeling it would make the next step impossible. "I asked 3 other people. 2 didn't answer. 1 told me to go home. 5 adults, 5 refusals. And then this child had seen a human man standing in the snow with a lame horse, and she had walked up to him because her mother had once told her how to spot a safe stranger, and she had nothing left to try. Varen felt something shift inside him, not the clean, noble shift of a man deciding to be heroic. Something messier than that, something closer to shame. "Rin, I'm going to help you find your mother." She didn't thank him. She looked at him for a long moment, measuring the distance between a promise and the truth. "Why?" she asked. "Because you asked. I asked other people too." "I know, and they were wrong not to help. I'm not going to be wrong tonight." Rin considered this. Then she nodded, a single sharp dip of her chin that carried more gravity than any handshake Varen had ever received in a boardroom. "Okay," she said, "but I'm not going back to my apartment. I already checked. She's not there." "Where do you think we should look?" The question surprised her. He could see it in the way her weight shifted, the way her eyes widened slightly. She was used to being told, "Lord Crow's estate. That's where she went yesterday morning. That's the last place anyone saw her. Then that's where we'll go." The animal would be fine for a few hours. The overhang kept the worst of the snow off, and he loosened the girth to let her rest. Then he turned to Rhine. "It's a long walk to the Crow estate. At least 40 minutes in this weather. Are you warm enough?" "I'm fine." She wasn't. He could see the tremor in her jaw, the way she kept her hands pulled up inside her too long sleeves. But she said she was fine with such fierce certainty that arguing felt like an insult. They walked. The Greyward at night, in winter, was a different world from the one Varen inhabited on the other side of the Kettle Bridge. The streets were narrower, the buildings pressed closer together, as if huddling for warmth. Lanterns hung from hooks on some doorways, casting circles of amber light on the snow. And in those circles, Varen caught glimpses of a life he had never considered. A woman scrubbing a pot in a window. 2 old orc men sitting on a covered porch, smoking pipes, watching the snow fall with the patient resignation of people who had seen many winters and expected nothing from any of them. A child's face appearing briefly at a frosted window, then vanishing. And everywhere he walked, he was seen. Not challenged, not threatened. Just seen. An orc woman carrying firewood stopped and stared, her expression unreadable. A young orc man leaning against a doorframe straightened up as Varen passed, his eyes tracking the human with an alertness that wasn't aggressive but wasn't relaxed either. An old woman on a second-floor balcony looked down at them, at Varen, at Rin walking beside him, and her face did something complicated. Not anger, not approval, something between recognition and disbelief, as if she were watching a thing she had long considered impossible. Varen realized, with a discomfort that sat right behind his sternum, that he was the only human on this street, possibly the only human in the entire Greyward tonight. He was the outsider here, the one who didn't belong, the one whose presence required explanation. It was not a feeling he was accustomed to. "You walk fast for a human," Rin said, breaking the silence. "You walk fast for someone with legs that short." The ghost of something, not quite a smile but its distant cousin, crossed Rin's face. It lasted less than a second, and then the worry was back. "Tell me about your mother," Varen said. Not because he needed the information right now, but because the girl had been carrying fear in her body like a physical weight, and sometimes talking about the person you're afraid for is lighter than silence. "Her name is Maitha Goreclaw. She's a healer, the best healer in the Greyward. Everyone says so. She knows plants, roots, bark, things that grow in places most people won't go. She can set a bone so clean you'd think it was never broken. She can bring a fever down in a night." How did she end up working for Lord Crow? Rin's expression tightened. She didn't choose it. Lord Crow's son got the river sickness 2 years ago. The human doctors couldn't fix it. Someone told Lord Crow about my mother, and he sent men to bring her. She healed his son. After that, Lord Crow said she owed him a debt. She saved his son. That's not how he saw it. He said she used his kitchen, his hearth, his supplies. He said the herbs she used came from his land. He made her sign a contract. Rin said the word contract with a bitterness that should not have been possible in a 7-year-old's mouth. Now she works for him, 5 days a week, tending to his household, his servants, anyone who gets sick or hurt on his estate. He pays her, but barely, and the debt never gets smaller. Varen stopped walking. He knew Harbin Crow. Not well. The man moved in different circles. Older money landed gentry rather than merchant class. But Varen knew the type. Men who accumulated people the way others accumulated property. Men who found ways to make generosity look like obligation, who turned a favor into a leash. How much does she owe? But she cries about it sometimes when she thinks I'm asleep. They kept walking. The snow was heavier now, falling in thick, wet clusters that stuck to everything. Varen's coat, Rhine's hair, the rooftops, the fences, the world itself. Visibility had dropped to maybe 20 paces. The Greyward was disappearing into white. "Your father," Varen said carefully, "is he dead?" The word came fast, preemptive, as if she'd learned to get it out before anyone could fumble around it. "He died in the border war. Before I was born. He was a scout for the Allied companies. Mother says he was brave." A pause. "She says he was the kind of person who walked toward trouble instead of away from it. The border war." Varen remembered it. The 3-year conflict along the Ashen March, where orc and human forces had fought together against the Cathari raiders, a joint campaign that had been sold to both populations as proof that the races could cooperate. But when the war ended and the veterans came home, the cooperation had evaporated. The orc soldiers got smaller pensions, fewer honors, less recognition. Within 5 years, the Greyward had doubled in population. Orc families from the border regions displaced and resettled with promises that were never kept. Varen had profited from the border war. His company had supplied grain and leather to the allied companies. He'd made more money in those 3 years than in the previous decade combined. Rin's father had died in it. The connections sat in Varen's mind like a coal, small and hot. They were approaching the edge of the Greyward now. The buildings were thinning, giving way to the open ground between the Orc Quarter and the estates that ringed the northern edge of the city. The Crow estate was visible in the distance, a large stone manor with lit windows, sitting on a rise like a crown on a bald head. Even through the snow, it radiated wealth, the kind of wealth that could be seen from the Greyward every day, a constant reminder of the distance between here and there. Rin, when we get to the estate, let me do the talking. Lord Crow's people won't respond well to an orc child asking questions. I know. Mother told me. She said, when you're in a human space, make yourself small and quiet and useful. And maybe they'll forget you're green. Make yourself quiet. Maybe they'll forget what you are. He thought of his own daughter. He didn't have one, had never had children, had never wanted them. But in this moment, he imagined one, a girl Rin's age, and he imagined someone telling her to make herself invisible so that the world would tolerate her existence. The thought was unbearable, and it was an orc child's daily reality. You don't have to be small tonight, Varen said. Not with me. The snow was in her eyelashes, on her cheeks, settling into the creases of her too-big coat. Her tusks caught the faint light from the distant estate. You mean that? She said. Not a question. I mean it. Mother would like you, I think. She says most humans are just scared, not bad. She says the scared ones are worse sometimes because they hurt you by accident and then tell themselves it wasn't their fault. Varen absorbed this. It was, he thought, one of the most precise descriptions of structural cowardice he had ever heard, and it had come from a woman he'd never met, filtered through her 7-year-old daughter, standing in a snowstorm. They reached the low stone wall that marked the boundary of the Crow estate. Beyond it, a gravel path led up to the main house, flanked by bare oak trees, whose branches held the snow like outstretched hands. Lanterns on iron poles lined the path, their light steady and warm. It was, Varen noted, the best-lit stretch of road he'd seen since leaving the merchant quarter. Lord Crow's property was well-maintained in a way that the Greyward was not. The contrast was not subtle. Rhine stopped at the wall. Her hand found the stone and rested there, and Varen saw her fingers tighten. I've never been here before, she said. Mother doesn't bring me. She says, it's not a place for anyone tonight, but that's where we need to go. What if they won't tell us anything? Varen looked at the manor. He thought about the name Ashcroft, about what it meant in this city, about the doors that opened when he said it, and the ones that stayed shut when an orc woman said Goreclaw. They'll tell us, he said, because I'm going to ask in a language Lord Crow understands. What language is that? It came out as a small huff, a puff of frozen breath, and she covered her mouth with her sleeve as if laughter were something she'd been taught to hide. They climbed over the wall, Varen first, then Rhine, who scrambled up the stones with a nimbleness that made him feel old and clumsy, and started up the gravel path toward the golden windows of the Crow estate. The snow fell harder. The world behind them disappeared. The front door of the Crow estate was oak, iron-studded, and twice the height of a man. Varen knocked, not the measured knock of a social caller, but the flat-palmed strike of someone who expected the door to open and would not be patient about it. A servant answered, human, middle-aged, wearing the Crow livery, dark green with a silver stag embroidered on the breast. His eyes went to Varen first, read the quality of his coat, the set of his jaw, and then dropped to Rhine. The reading changed. His mouth thinned into something that wasn't quite a frown, but served the same function. The service entrance is around the back, he said, and we don't receive orc visitors after. I'm here to see Lord Crow. The name did what names like that always do. The servant's posture recalibrated, shoulders back, chin lifted, the thin mouth reshaping itself into something more accommodating. He knew the name. Everyone in Valethorn's upper commerce knew the name. Ashcroft Trading controlled more shipping tonnage than any three competitors combined. Mr. Ashcroft. Of course. I apologize. I didn't. Please, come in. His eyes flicked to Rhine again. The child can wait in the... The child comes with me. A pause. The servant's training wrestled with his instincts and lost. Very well, sir. I'll inform Lord Crow you're here. If you'll wait in the reception hall. They stepped inside, and the temperature changed so abruptly that Wren made a small sound. Not quite a gasp, but the involuntary exhale of a body suddenly relieved of a burden it had been carrying for hours. The entrance hall was warm, almost aggressively so. A fire burned in a stone hearth large enough to stand in. The floors were polished marble. Tapestries hung from the walls, hunting scenes, harvest scenes, one depicting the founding of Valethorn with humans at the center, and orcs conspicuously absent from the frame. Rin stood very still beside Varen. She had pulled her arms in tight, her bag pressed against her stomach, and she was looking at the marble floor as if she were afraid her boots would leave marks on it. She was making herself small, Varen realized, exactly the way her mother had taught her. You don't have to do that here, he said quietly. Do what? Then she looked at the hall, at the fire, the marble, the tapestries, the wealth hanging from every surface like decoration but functioning as declaration. This is ours. This is what we have, and you don't. My mother walks through this door every morning, Rin said. Every morning she comes here, and every evening she goes back to the Greyward. I never thought about what that walk felt like until right now. Varen didn't answer. He was thinking the same thing. Footsteps echoed from the corridor. A man appeared. Not Lord Crow himself, but someone who carried authority the way a weapon is carried. Visibly, and with the understanding that others should notice. He was perhaps 50, lean, with gray hair cut close to his skull, and a face that looked like it had been designed for the specific purpose of refusing requests. Mr. Ashcroft, I'm Theron Galt, steward of the Crow estate. Lord Crow is occupied this evening and regrets that he cannot receive visitors. Perhaps you might send a card and arrange. I'm not here for a social visit, Galt. I'm here about an orc woman named Matha Goreclaw. She works for this household. A healer. She didn't come home last night, and her daughter hasn't seen her since yesterday morning. Galt's expression didn't change. That was the tell. A man with nothing to hide would have reacted. Surprise, concern, confusion. Galt's face remained as smooth and controlled as a plastered wall. I'm afraid I don't oversee the domestic staff schedules, Mr. Ashcroft. You'd need to speak with the household manager, Mrs. Everly, and she's retired for the evening. Then unretire her. I beg your pardon. A woman who works in this house has been missing for over 24 hours. Her daughter is standing right here. She's 7 years old, and she's been alone in the Greyward since last night. I don't care what time it is, and I don't care who's retired for the evening. Someone in this house knows where Matha Goreclaw is, and I'm not leaving until I find out. Galt looked at Rhine. For the first time, his composure shifted, not toward sympathy, but toward calculation. He was measuring the situation, weighing the cost of cooperation against the cost of refusal, and the name Ashcroft was a heavy weight on one side of that scale. Wait here, he said, and left. The silence that followed was thick. Rin stood beside Varen, her eyes fixed on the corridor where Galt had disappeared. Her hands were no longer pulled inside her sleeves. They hung at her sides, fists clenched, and Varen could see the tension running through her like a wire pulled taut. He knows something, Rin said. Yes. His face didn't move when you said her name. That means he already knew. Varen looked down at her, 7 years old, and she was reading micro-expressions with the accuracy of a seasoned negotiator. Survival, he thought. That's what teaches you to read faces like that. Not education, not training, but the daily necessity of knowing which adults are safe and which ones aren't. You're very observant, he said. Mother says if you can't be big, be sharp. 5, then 10. Varen could hear muffled sounds from deeper in the house, A door closing, voices too distant to make out, footsteps moving in one direction and then another. Rin sat on the edge of a wooden bench near the hearth, her bag in her lap, her feet not touching the floor. She looked impossibly small against the scale of the room, like a sparrow perched in a cathedral. Then Galt returned. And he was not alone. The woman beside him was in her 60s, heavy-set, with the reddened hands and practical bearing of someone who had spent her life managing other people's domestic lives. Mrs. Everly, presumably. She looked at Varen with the resigned expression of a person who has been woken from sleep and is determined to make this interaction as brief as possible. Mr. Ashcroft. Theron tells me you're asking about one of our orc staff, Matha Goreclaw, healer, employed here under contract. Yes, I know who she is. Mrs. Goreclaw came in for her shift yesterday morning as usual. She tended to one of the groundskeepers who'd cut his hand, and then Lord Crow requested her services for a private consultation in the afternoon. Everly hesitated. She glanced at Galt, who gave nothing. Lord Crow has been experiencing joint pain. He asked Mrs. Goreclaw to prepare a course of treatment. She was working in the East Wing preparing medicines when I last saw her. And after that, I left for the day at 6 o'clock. She was still working. Did she leave the estate? Another hesitation. Longer this time. Mrs. Everly's hands came together in front of her, fingers lacing, a self-comforting gesture that Varen recognized from 1,000 business negotiations. People do that when they're about to say something they know is insufficient. I don't know. I assumed she did. She always walks home in the evening. She didn't walk home yesterday, and she didn't walk home today. Where is she? Mr. Ashcroft, I truly don't. Where is she? The sharpness in his voice surprised even himself. He had not raised it. Varen was not a man who raised his voice, but something in the tone had changed. Some layer of patience stripped away, and Mrs. Everly flinched. Rin slid off the bench and walked to stand beside Varen. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her presence, this small orc child in a too-big coat standing in the marble hall of the man who held her mother's debt, said everything that words could not. Mrs. Everly looked at her, really looked, and something cracked in the woman's professional armor. There's a room, she said quietly. In the East Wing. Lord Crow sometimes, when a servant owes him money and falls behind on the terms, he has a room. It's not a cell, not exactly. It has a bed, a basin, but the door locks from the outside. Varen felt it, a shift in pressure, in temperature, in the quality of the silence. Beside him, Rin had gone completely still, the kind of stillness that precedes either collapse or eruption. Are you telling me, Varen said, each word placed with surgical precision, that Lord Crow has locked a woman in a room in his house because she owes him money? It's happened before, not often. He calls it a corrective residency. The contract allows for it technically. There's a clause about failure to meet debt obligations, and if he determines that the servant's work has been, take me there, now. The steward's face had gone gray, not from shock, but from the dawning recognition that the presence of Varen Ashcroft in this house had just transformed a routine piece of cruelty into something with consequences. I don't have the authority to. I'm not asking for your authority. I'm asking for directions. You can walk me there or you can give me the directions, and I'll find it myself. But one of those options ends with Lord Crow learning that his household staff cooperated with a member of the Merchant Guild, who is currently compiling a very specific account of what's happened here tonight. And the other ends with Lord Crow learning that they didn't. Everly exchanged a look, the kind of look shared by people who have long served a powerful man and have long known that the things he does are wrong, and have long chosen not to know what they know. The look lasted 3 seconds. Then Mrs. Everly turned. Follow me. They walked through the house, past the formal dining room with its 20-seat table, past the library with its floor-to-ceiling shelves, past Lord Crow's study, where lamplight glowed under the closed door and the faint sound of a man humming could be heard. Crow himself, apparently, comfortable in his evening routine, while a woman sat locked in a room on the other side of his home. If you're enjoying this story, take a second to leave a comment and hit subscribe, and don't forget to check out our other channel, Orc-Thorn Chronicles, pinned right there in the comments. Now, back to Ryan and Varen. The east wing was colder, fewer fireplaces, narrower corridors, the floors shifting from marble to bare stone. This was the working part of the house, the part that guests never saw, where the meals were prepared, the linens laundered, the daily machinery of wealth kept running by hands that belonged to people whose names the master of the house probably didn't know. Mrs. Everleigh stopped at a door. It was unremarkable. Same wood, same iron hardware as every other door in the corridor, except for the bolt. A heavy iron bolt, mounted on the outside, slid into a bracket in the doorframe. It was the kind of hardware that didn't need explanation. Everyone who looked at it understood what it meant. The bolt was engaged. Rin saw it. Her breath caught, a small, wet sound barely audible. But Varen heard it because he was listening for it. He'd been listening for every sound this child made since they'd met, calibrating his actions to her capacity, trying to stay one step ahead of the moment when the weight she was carrying would exceed what her small frame could hold. "Open it," Varen said. Mrs. Everleigh drew the bolt. The scrape of iron on iron was loud in the silent corridor, and as the bolt cleared the bracket, Varen heard something from inside the room. Movement, the creak of a bed frame, and then a voice. Hoarse, thin, but unmistakable in its urgency. "Who's there? Rin, is that? Rin?" Rin broke. She lunged past Mrs. Everleigh, past Varen, through the door and into the room. The sound that came from her was not a word. It was older than words, older than language. The sound a child makes when the worst fear in her world dissolves, and what's left is relief so enormous it can't fit inside a body that small. Varen stepped into the doorway and stopped. The room was small, perhaps 10 feet by 12, a narrow bed against one wall, a basin on a wooden stand, a chamber pot in the corner, a single window, high and barred, let in a stripe of snow-gray light. It was clean but barren, functional without comfort, a space designed to hold a person without technically qualifying as a prison. Matha Goreclaw sat on the edge of the bed with her daughter crushed against her chest. She was taller than Varen had expected. Even sitting, even hunched around her child, she carried height in her frame, long-limbed, angular, with the wiry strength of someone who worked with her hands for long hours. Her skin was darker green than Rhine's, mottled at the temples and along her jawline with the deeper pigmentation that orc women developed in their 30s. Her hair was loose, black and thick, falling past her shoulders in tangles that spoke of 2 days without a comb. Her tusks were longer than Rhine's, fully adult, curving slightly upward from her lower jaw, the left one chipped near the tip. She wore the same clothes she'd been wearing when she was locked in, a gray healer's tunic, practical and plain, the sleeves pushed up to her elbows, revealing forearms marked with the small burn scars that came from years of working with boiling tinctures. Her feet were bare. She had been crying. The tracks were visible on her face, dried and re-dried in layers. But she was not crying now. She was holding her daughter with a ferocity that made the air in the room feel dense. Her eyes squeezed shut, her mouth pressed against the top of Ryan's head, breathing her in. "I'm here, baby. I'm here. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." "You didn't come home." Rin's voice was muffled against her mother's chest. "You always come home and you didn't come home. I swear I tried." Varen stood in the doorway and did not enter. This moment was not his. He understood that with a clarity that surprised him, that his role here was witness, not participant, and that to step into that room uninvited would be to intrude on something that had been earned through 24 hours of terror and faith by a child who had never stopped believing her mother would be found. Behind him, Mrs. Everleigh stood with her hands clasped and her eyes on the floor. Galt had not come with them. Varen noted that. The steward had found his limit. The door he wouldn't walk through, the thing he wouldn't look at directly. It was, in its way, a confession. Matha opened her eyes. She saw Varen, and her reaction was not what he expected. She pushed Rin behind her, gently but completely, one arm sweeping her daughter to the far side of the bed, placing her own body between the child and the human man in the doorway. Her expression went flat. Not angry, not frightened, but guarded in a way that was deeper than either. The expression of a woman who had learned that human men in positions of authority were a category of threat that required a specific kind of vigilance. "Who are you?" she said. Her voice was raw from disuse and crying, but steady. "My name is Varen Ashcroft. Your daughter found me on the street. She told me you were missing. I helped her look for you." Maitha's eyes moved from Varen to the corridor behind him, to Mrs. Everly's bowed head, and then back to Varen. She was assembling the picture, filling in the gaps with the speed of a woman who had spent years navigating human spaces and reading human intentions. "Ashcroft," she repeated. "The traitor." "Yes. What do you want?" The question was direct in a way that left no room for pleasantries. She was not going to thank him. Not yet. Maybe not ever. She was going to understand what this cost first. Because in Methagorclaw's experience, human men did not help orc women for free. There was always a ledger. There was always a debt. "I don't want anything," Varen said. "Your daughter asked for help. I helped." Maitha looked at him the way Ryan had looked at him an hour ago, measuring the distance between a promise and the truth. The resemblance between mother and daughter in that moment was striking. The same amber eyes, the same tilt of the head, the same refusal to accept comfort before confirming it was safe. "Mommy, he's good," Rin said from behind Maitha's shoulder. "I checked his hands like you taught me, and his eyes. He's the kind that walks toward trouble." Her jaw tightened. Her hand found Rin's knee behind her and gripped it. That was the phrase she used to describe Rin's father, the dead scout, the brave man who walked toward trouble instead of away from it. Her daughter had given a dead man's compliment to a living stranger, and Maitha didn't know whether to be moved or terrified. "Mrs. Goreclaw," Varen said, "you've been locked in this room for over 24 hours. You're dehydrated, you haven't eaten, and your daughter has been alone in the Greyward since last night. We need to get you out of this house. But before we leave, I need to know. Did Crow do this himself? Did he order it? Deciding how much to say, how much to trust, how much of her private humiliation she was willing to expose to a man she'd known for less than a minute. "I was preparing medicines in the workroom," she said. "Lord Crow came in. He told me the terms of my contract had changed. He said I'd been underperforming, that the treatments I'd been providing weren't sufficient, that he'd consulted another physician who said my methods were outdated. He said he was adding 6 months to my debt. 6 months. I told him that wasn't in the contract. I told him I'd fulfilled every obligation for 2 years, that the debt should be decreasing, not growing. He said the contract allowed for adjustments at his discretion. I said I wanted to see the clause. He said I was being difficult." She paused. Her hand was still on Rin's knee. "He called Galt. Galt brought me here. Lord Crow said I could come out when I was ready to accept the new terms." Varen felt something settle in his chest. Not anger. Anger was too simple, too clean. What he felt was the specific, grinding recognition of a system he had lived inside, without examining. He knew men like Crow. He'd dined with them. He'd done business with them. He'd sat in rooms where the phrase orc labor contracts was discussed as a market category, a resource to be optimized, and he had never once asked what happened to the people inside those contracts when the optimization turned cruel. "Get your things," he said. "We're leaving." "I can't," Maitha said. "The contract. If I leave without authorization, he can claim breach. He can take the apartment. Everything I own in this city is tied to that debt. I'll deal with the contract." "You don't understand, Hill." "I understand perfectly. Harbin Crow is a man who locks women in rooms. The contract isn't a legal document. It's a chain, and chains are only useful as long as the person wearing them believes they can't be broken." Maitha stared at him. The guard was still there. The wariness, the calculation, the bone-deep distrust of a human man offering something that sounded like rescue. But underneath it, something else was moving. Something that looked from the doorway like the first tentative stirring of hope in a person who had trained herself to stop hoping. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. "You don't know me. You don't owe me anything. Your daughter asked me that same question tonight. I told her, because she asked. But I'll tell you something different, because you're an adult, and you deserve a better answer." Varen paused. "I'm doing this because I built my business on a system that allows men like Crow to do what he did to you, and I never looked at it closely enough to see what it actually costs. Your daughter showed me tonight. She walked me through the Greyward, and she showed me what my world looks like from the other side. I owe her more than I can pay back in one night. This is a start." The room was quiet. Snow ticked against the barred window. Somewhere deep in the house, a clock chimed 9. Matha stood. She was unsteady. 2 days without proper food or water had taken their toll, and Rin was immediately beside her, small hands gripping her mother's arm, bracing with a strength that seemed impossible for her size. "My shoes," Matha said. "They took my shoes." Varen turned to Mrs. Everly, who was still in the corridor, still staring at the floor. Her shoes, now. Everly left without a word and returned 2 minutes later with a pair of worn leather boots. Matha put them on in silence, her movements stiff and deliberate, the movements of a woman reassembling her dignity one piece at a time. They walked back through the house, Varen in front, Matha behind him with Rin pressed against her side, Mrs. Everly trailing at a distance like a woman walking behind her own conscience. They were halfway through the formal dining room when a door opened ahead of them. Lord Harbin Crow stepped into the corridor. He was smaller than Varen had imagined. A slight man, 60 or so, with thin white hair combed across a freckled scalp. He wore a quilted house coat and slippers, and he held a glass of wine in one hand. Red, expensive, half empty. His face was the kind that looked pleasant in the right light, the kind that got away with things because it didn't match the cruelty it was capable of. "What's this?" Crow said. His eyes went to Matha, then to Rin, then to Varen, and his expression rearranged itself through 3 distinct phases: surprise, irritation, assessment. "Ashcroft, what in the world are you doing in my house at this hour?" "Leaving," Varen said, "with Mrs. Goreclaw and her daughter." "I see. And did Mrs. Everly explain to you the nature of Mrs. Goreclaw's arrangement with this household? She's under contract. She has obligations. She has a daughter who spent last night alone because you locked her mother in a room." Crow sipped his wine. The casualness of it, the deliberate performative calm, was designed to establish control. Varen recognized the tactic because he'd used it himself in different rooms, for different reasons. "Mr. Ashcroft, I understand this might look alarming to someone unfamiliar with the specifics. Mrs. Goreclaw has a significant debt. The contract includes provisions for, let's call it a cooling-off period when disagreements arise about terms. It's all documented, legal, quite standard for long-term service arrangements in the domestic sector. You locked a woman in a room. I provided a space for reflection during a contractual dispute. Her daughter is 7 years old. She was alone, in the Grey Word, in a snowstorm for 24 hours. Crow's gaze dropped to Rhine. The girl stood half behind her mother, but she was looking at Crow with an expression that Varen had never seen on a child's face. Not fear, not anger. Recognition. She was looking at the man who owned her mother's time, her mother's labor, her mother's freedom, and she recognized him the way prey recognizes a predator. Not with surprise, but with the tired familiarity of someone who has always known the shape of the thing that hunts her. "That," Crow said, "is not my responsibility. I didn't tell the child to wander the streets. If Mrs. Goreclaw had simply agreed to the revised terms, she could have gone home yesterday afternoon." Matha spoke. Her voice cut through the room like a blade drawn from a sheath, quiet, controlled, and edged. "You added 6 months to a debt I've been paying for 2 years. The original contract said 18 months. I'm at 24. Every time I get close to the end, you change the terms. The contract allows for adjustment. The contract allows for you to keep me forever, and you know it. You wrote it that way." Crow's eyes narrowed, the pleasant face thinned, and for a moment Varen saw the man underneath, the one who calculated the exact amount of cruelty that could be applied before it became inconvenient. "Be very careful, Mrs. Goreclaw. You're in my house, speaking to me in front of." "She's leaving your house," Varen said, "tonight, and she's not coming back." Crow turned to him. The assessment was complete. Now no more surprise, no more performance, just the cold arithmetic of a man calculating what he could afford to lose. "And what exactly gives you the authority to make that decision, Ashcroft?" "You're a trader. Grain, leather, shipping contracts. You deal in cargo. This is a domestic matter, and frankly, it's none of your concern." "You're right. I deal in contracts. which means I know what a legal contract looks like, and I know what coercion dressed in legal language looks like. What you have with Mrs. Goreclaw isn't a contract. It's an indenture, and indentures were outlawed in Valethorn 12 years ago, after the reform accords that you, Lord Crow, voted against in the city council. Varen had not planned to say that. He hadn't walked into this house with a legal strategy, but he'd sat through enough council sessions, enough guild meetings, enough late-night arguments about trade policy to know the shape of the law and the shape of what Crow was doing sat outside it. Barely, awkwardly, but outside it. That's an interesting interpretation, Crow said carefully. It's the interpretation the magistrate's office will make when I present Mrs. Goreclaw's contract alongside a sworn account of a woman being locked in a room without food, water, or access to her child. I'll file it tomorrow morning. Unless what? The debt, the terms, the adjustments, the entire arrangement. Mrs. Goreclaw walks out of here free and clear, and you forget her name. The silence that followed was a living thing. It filled the dining room, pressed against the walls, settled into the corners where the lamplight didn't reach. Crow's eyes moved from Varen to Metha to Rhine and back to Varen, running the calculation over and over, looking for the angle, the leverage, the way out. Metha stood perfectly still. She was not looking at Crow. She was looking at Varen with an expression that Varen couldn't read, not because it was guarded, but because it contained too many things at once. Disbelief, recognition, the vertigo of watching a door open that you'd convinced yourself was a wall. And if I refuse, Crow said, then tomorrow morning becomes very uncomfortable for you. I know 6 members of the Merchant Guild Council personally. I know the editor of the Valethorn Gazette. I know the magistrate's chief clerk. And now I know what you do to orc women who disagree with you. That's a lot of knowing, Lord Crow. The question is whether you'd like it to stay in this room or leave it. Crow set down his wine glass. The click of crystal on wood was the loudest sound in the room. His hand was steady, but his jaw worked. The small, grinding motion of a man swallowing something that tasted like loss. The woman is an exceptional healer, he said quietly. Not to Varen, not to anyone. To the room itself, as if lodging a complaint with the universe. Do you know how difficult it is to find competent orc healers willing to work in a human household? The things she can do with bark and root, human physicians can't match it. I wasn't trying to. You were. You knew exactly what you were doing. You found someone whose skills were worth more than what you were paying, and you built a cage around her so she couldn't leave. That's not employment. That's theft. Opened again. Fine. The contract is void. Take her. Take the child. I'll have the papers drawn up and sent to your offices in the morning. No, you'll write it now, on the back of the contract itself. Terminated by mutual agreement. All debts discharged. Signed, dated, witnessed by Mrs. Everly and Mr. Galt. You can't be serious. I've never been less interested in not being serious, Lord Crow. Another silence. Shorter this time, because the outcome was already decided. Crow knew it. The only question was how much dignity Crow would attempt to salvage, and the answer turned out to be very little. He called for Galt. The steward appeared with the speed of a man who had been listening from the next room. Crow instructed him to bring the Goreclaw contract from his study. When Galt returned with the document, 3 pages of dense script on heavy paper, Crow took it, turned to the last page, and wrote in the margin. His handwriting was small and precise, the penmanship of a man who documented everything, and Varen read the words upside down as they appeared. Contract terminated by agreement of both parties. All obligations discharged. No further claims. Crow signed it. Galt signed it. Mrs. Everly signed it. Varen took the document, folded it, and placed it inside his coat. Mrs. Goreclaw, Varen said, we're leaving. She stood in Lord Crow's dining room, her daughter pressed against her side, and she looked at the man who had owned her labor for 2 years. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The look she gave him was enough. Not hatred, not triumph, but something quieter and more devastating. The look of a person seeing clearly, for the first time, how small their captor actually was. Then she turned and walked toward the door. Rin followed, but at the threshold she stopped. She turned back to Crow, and the old lord actually flinched, at being looked at by a 7-year-old orc girl. "My mother cried about you," Rin said, "at night when she thought I was sleeping. She cried because of what you did to her. I want you to know that I heard it every time." She turned and walked out. No one in the room breathed for several seconds. The cold hit them as they stepped through the front door, a wall of frozen air after the suffocating warmth of the manor. The snow had not stopped. If anything, it had intensified, falling now in sheets that blurred the landscape into abstraction. The lanterns along the gravel path were halos, the oak trees were ghosts, and the world beyond the estate grounds had disappeared entirely. Matha stopped on the top step and breathed. One deep, shuddering breath that seemed to pull in not just air but the entire night. The cold, the snow, the dark, the freedom. Her eyes were closed, and her fists were clenched at her sides, and she stood there for 5 full seconds, just breathing. And Varen understood that he was watching a woman remember what it felt like to stand outside without a chain attached to the door behind her. Rin took her mother's hand. Matha's fingers closed around it. Not gently, not carefully, but with a grip that said, "I am never letting go of this hand again." "Can you walk?" Varen asked. "It's a long way back to the Grey Word. I've been walking longer distances on less," Matha said. Her voice was different now. Still raw, still hoarse, but there was something underneath it that hadn't been there in the locked room. Bedrock. The sound of a woman who had found the bottom of her situation and discovered that she could stand on it. They descended the steps and started down the path. The snow swallowed their footprints almost as fast as they made them. They walked in silence for a long time, not the tense silence of the walk to the estate, but something different. The silence of people who have been through something together and haven't yet found the language for it. The Grey Word looked different on the way back, or maybe Varen was looking at it differently. The same narrow streets, the same low buildings, the same dim lanterns. But now he was walking beside a woman who lived here, a woman whose boots knew every frozen rut in the road, whose eyes tracked the familiar shapes of home through the falling snow. Matha walked with her head up, not defiantly, not performatively, just up, the posture of a woman who was walking toward something instead of away from it. Rin held her mother's hand on one side and walked close to Varen on the other. Not holding his hand, she hadn't reached for it, but close enough that her shoulder occasionally brushed his arm, close enough to be deliberate. They passed the smokehouse where Ryan had asked for help that morning. It was dark and shuttered. Metha looked at it, and Varen saw her jaw tighten. The subtle flex of muscle that meant she was adding something to an internal ledger, filing it away in the place where mothers keep track of who failed their children. "Rin," Matha said, "you said you went to school today." The girl didn't answer immediately. Her stride shortened, just slightly, the physical tell of a child bracing for a conversation she'd been hoping to avoid. "Rin, I didn't go to school. I haven't been going to school." Matha stopped walking. The snow fell around them, thick and indifferent. "What do you mean you haven't been going? Since when?" The headmaster said there were too many orc students. He said I should come back in the spring, but there were empty chairs. Mama, I saw them. He just... 3 weeks. Metha's voice was very quiet, the kind of quiet that contains more force than shouting. "You've been pretending to go to school for 3 weeks. I didn't want you to worry. You already had Lord Crow in the debt, and you were so tired, Mama. I didn't want to add more." Matha knelt in the snow. She took her daughter's face in both hands, large, scarred, capable hands against small green cheeks, and she looked at Ryan with an expression that Varen had to turn away from. Not because it was private, though it was, because it contained a grief so specific, so maternal, that witnessing it felt like trespassing. The grief of a mother learning that her child had been carrying a wound in silence to protect her. The grief of realizing that your 7-year-old daughter had decided she needed to be strong because she didn't believe you could afford to be weak. "You never add more," Matha said. "Do you hear me? You never, ever add more. You are not a burden. Not to me, not ever. You come to me with everything, the big things and the small things and the things you think don't matter. You come to me. That is my job. That is the only job I will never, ever quit." the carefully maintained 7-year-old stoicism that had carried her through 24 hours of fear. It crumbled, all at once, like a wall that had been holding back water. She pressed her face into her mother's neck and cried. Not the polite, restrained crying of a child performing distress, but the raw, ugly, full-body sobbing of a child who had finally found the one person in the world who made it safe to fall apart. Matha held her, rocked her, said nothing, just held her in the snow, on a frozen street in the Grey Ward, while the night came down around them. Varen stood a few paces away, his back half turned, his eyes on the rooftops. He was not needed in this moment, he knew that. But he didn't leave, because leaving would have felt like cutting a rope while someone was still climbing it. So he stood, and he waited, and he let the snow land on him, and he thought about things he had not thought about in years. He thought about his own father, a man who had built Ashcroft Trading from a single wagon and a handshake, and who had never once asked Varen how he was feeling, who had taught him that success was a fortress you built around yourself, and that the walls were the point, not what lived inside them. He thought about the council meetings where orc labor contracts were agenda item 7 or 8, wedged between tariff adjustments and port fees, discussed in the same flat technical language used for every other commodity. Labor supply, market rates, compliance frameworks. He thought about Ren standing outside the farrier's shop, asking a stranger for help because 5 adults had already said no. When Matha finally stood, Ren still clinging to her. Her face was wet, but her eyes were clear. She looked at Varen, and for the first time the guard was down. Not gone. A woman like Matha Goreclaw would probably never be entirely unguarded around a human man, but lowered enough that Varen could see what was behind it. Exhaustion, gratitude, and something else, harder to name. The look of a person who is revising their understanding of the world to accommodate a thing they didn't think was possible. "Thank you," she said. 2 words, no elaboration, no qualification, no conditions. Just the words, offered without decoration, heavy with everything she didn't say. "You don't owe me anything," Varen said. "I mean that. I know you mean it. That's why it's hard to hear." They walked the rest of the way to Matha's apartment in a silence that had changed again. Warmer now, closer to comfortable, the silence of people who have seen each other clearly and decided not to look away. The building on Maple Street looked smaller than Varen had imagined. 3 stories, timber frame. The walls patched in places where the plaster had cracked and been repaired with a different color. The blue door that Ryan had described was faded to almost gray, its paint peeling at the edges. A set of narrow stairs climbed to the 2nd floor, each step worn smooth by years of feet. Matha unlocked the apartment. The door opened onto a single room that served as kitchen, sitting area, and, separated by a curtain made from what looked like an old bedsheet, sleeping space. It was small, smaller than Varen's study at home, smaller than the room Crow had locked Matha in, which was a comparison that landed in Varen's mind with a sickening weight. But the room was alive. That was the thing that struck him. Not the size, not the poverty, but the aliveness of it. Dried herbs hung from the ceiling beams in thick bundles, filling the space with a scent that was sharp and green and medicinal. Jars lined the windowsill, dozens of them, each labeled in growl script, containing powders and pastes and dried leaves in colors Varen had never seen. A mortar and pestle sat on the kitchen table, well worn, the stone smooth from years of grinding. Drawings were pinned to the walls, rinds clearly done in charcoal and some kind of berry ink, showing trees and animals, and one image that stopped Varen cold. 2 figures, one large and one small, both green, holding hands under a sky full of stars. The apartment was cold. The fire had gone out. Of course it had. No one had been here to tend it. Varen moved to the hearth without being asked. The firewood was stacked neatly beside it, each piece cut to the same length, the kind of precision that spoke of someone who couldn't afford to waste anything, not even the effort of cutting wood. He built a fire the way his father had taught him, back before the money came, back when the Ashcroft family heated their home with their own hands. Matha watched him do this. She stood in the doorway of her own home, her daughter against her hip, and she watched a human man, a wealthy, powerful human man, kneel on her floor and build a fire in her hearth. The strangeness of it was visible on her face. Not discomfort. Exactly, disorientation. As if the world had tilted on its axis, and she was still finding her balance. Rin broke away from her mother and rummaged through a cupboard, producing a heel of dark bread, a jar of something that looked like preserved fruit, and a clay cup. She poured water from a covered pitcher and brought it to Matha, holding the cup with both hands, solemn as a priestess performing a ritual. "Drink first," Rin said. "Then eat. You always tell me that when I'm sick. Water first, then food." Mayatha took the cup. Her hand trembled, from cold, from hunger, from the particular kind of exhaustion that comes after prolonged fear. And some of the water spilled over the rim, running down her wrist. She drank, slowly, carefully, the way a healer drinks, knowing that a dehydrated body needs patience more than volume. The fire caught. Warmth began to spread through the room, tentative at first, then stronger, pushing back the cold that had settled into the walls and the floorboards and the air itself. The herbs on the ceiling began to release their scent more fully as the heat reached them, and the apartment filled with a fragrance that Varen had no name for, green and bitter and somehow comforting. Varen stood. The fire was burning well. The room was warming. Matha was eating slowly, Rin curled against her side on the narrow bed behind the curtain, already half asleep. It was time to go. He knew this. He'd known it for several minutes. But he stood in the small apartment of a woman he'd met 2 hours ago, surrounded by the evidence of a life he'd never imagined. The herbs, the jars, the drawings, the carefully cut firewood, the patched walls, the faded curtain, and he found that leaving was harder than anything he'd done tonight. Harder than confronting legal action. Harder than walking through the gray word, as the only human on the street. Because leaving meant going back. Back across the Kettle Bridge, back to the merchant quarter, back to the house with too many rooms and not enough reasons to be in them, back to the man he'd been 3 hours ago, the man who walked past things because he'd trained himself not to see them. Mr. Ashcroft. He turned. Metha was looking at him from the bed, Rin tucked against her, the girl's breathing already slowing toward sleep. "The contract, the paper you took from Crow. You'll keep it safe? I'll have copies made tomorrow. One for you, one for my solicitor, one for the magistrate's archive. Crow won't be able to touch it. And if he tries something else? A different contract, a different claim. Then he'll discover what it feels like to have the full weight of Ashcroft Trading's legal resources directed at him personally. Which, I promise you, is an experience he will not enjoy. You're risking something by doing this. Crow has friends, allies, people who benefit from the same system you described. Yes, and you're doing it anyway. Yes, she studied him, that measuring look, the one she shared with Rin, the one that weighed the distance between words and truth. But this time, whatever she found on the scale seemed to satisfy her. Her expression shifted, not softening exactly. Matha Goreclaw was not a woman who softened, but settling, the way stone settles after an earthquake. Finding its new position. "Rin was right about you," she said. "About my hands. About your eyes." Varen felt them land, felt the weight of them, the warmth of them, the complicated history embedded in them. A dead man's compliment, offered now by the woman who had loved him. Not a replacement. Not a comparison. Something new. An acknowledgement that certain qualities, the willingness to walk toward trouble, the inability to look away, could exist in more than one person, across the divide of species and history, and everything that was supposed to keep them separate. "I should go," Varen said. "Yes, you should." Neither of them moved for a moment. Then Rin stirred, her eyes fluttering open with the unfocused confusion of a child caught between sleep and waking. "Mr. Varen, are you leaving?" "I am. Your mother needs rest, and so do you." Rin sat up. She reached into her cloth bag, the bag she'd been carrying all night, pressed against her body, and pulled something out. A small object, no larger than a coin. She held it out to Varen in her open palm. It was a tooth, an orc tooth, a baby tusk, tiny and curved, the ivory yellowed with age. It hung on a loop of braided cord, the kind of simple, careful work that a child might do with patient fingers and no tools. "This is my first tusk," Rin said. It fell out last year. Mama said in the old days, orcs gave their first tusk to someone they wanted to remember them. Someone important. She held it higher, her amber eyes steady and serious. I want you to remember me. Varen took it. The tooth was lighter than he expected. Warm from being in her bag, pressed against her body through hours of cold and fear. And searching, he closed his fingers around it and felt the braided cord against his palm. I'll remember you, he said. I promise. You have to wear it. That's the rule. If you don't wear it, it doesn't work. Varen looked at Mytha. She was watching her daughter with an expression that Varen couldn't have described if he'd spent a year trying. Pride and pain and love and loss, and something that might have been the beginning of trust, all held in a single face, all directed at the impossible intersection of a 7-year-old orc girl giving a piece of herself to a human stranger. Mytha nodded once. Varen slipped the cord over his head. The tooth rested against his chest, beneath his shirt, small and sharp and real. It works, Rin said. She lay back down against her mother and closed her eyes. Within a minute, she was asleep. Varen looked at Mytha one last time. She looked back, and what passed between them in that moment was not romance. Not yet, maybe not ever, maybe something else entirely. But it was connection. The rare, difficult, hard-won kind that only forms when two people have seen the worst of a shared world and chosen, despite everything, not to turn away from each other. Good night, Mrs. Goreclaw. Mytha. Good night, Mytha. Good night, Varen. He let himself out. The door closed behind him with a soft click, and he stood on the landing for a moment, his hand on the railing, the cold air filling his lungs. Then he walked down the stairs and out into the snow. The Greyward was quiet, the kind of quiet that only exists in a city after a heavy snowfall, when the world has been muffled and smoothed and made temporarily merciful. Varen walked through it, past the darkened buildings, past the smokehouse, past the covered porch where the two old men had been sitting earlier. They were gone now, driven inside by the cold, but their chairs were still there, dusted with snow, waiting. He crossed the Kettle Bridge. The merchant quarter welcomed him back with its dressed stone and bright lamps and wide, clean streets, and Varen realized, with a clarity that hurt, that the bridge was only 40 paces long. 40 paces between the world Mytha lived in and the world he lived in. He'd walked that distance 1,000 times without ever crossing it. Tonight, a 7-year-old girl had made him cross. His house was dark when he arrived. Large, well-built, tastefully furnished, the home of a successful man, a man who had earned his place in the world. Varen walked through the front door and stood in his entrance hall, which was approximately the same size as Mytha's entire apartment. He didn't take off his coat. Not yet. He stood in the hallway and looked at himself in the mirror that hung near the door, an expensive thing, gilt-framed, imported from the southern workshops. The man looking back at him was the same man who had left this house that morning. Same face, same coat, same silver clasp, but the coat carried a different smell now. Wood smoke and herbs and the sharp green scent of an orc healer's apartment. Varen lifted his collar and breathed it in. He didn't know the names of the plants. He didn't know the words in Grell script on the jars. He didn't know 100 things about the world he'd walked through tonight, a world that existed 40 paces from his own. He didn't change his coat. He hung it by the door where the scent would linger. He reached inside his shirt and touched the tooth. Small, sharp, real. An orc child's first tusk, given to a human stranger, because she wanted him to remember her. As if he could forget. Varen sat down at his desk. He pulled a sheet of paper toward him, dipped a pen in ink, and began to write. Not a letter to his solicitor. That could wait until morning. Not a filing for the magistrate's office. That too. This was something else. A list, messy, unstructured. The handwriting of a man thinking faster than his hand could move. Orc labor contracts. Review all Ashcroft trading agreements. How many? What terms? Greyward schools. Who controls enrollment? Who makes the decisions? Healing practitioners. Orc methods. Efficacy. Why aren't they in the formal medical guild? The Reform Accords? What was actually implemented? What was ignored? The Kettle Bridge. 40 paces. Why does it feel like 40 miles? He wrote, until the candle burned low. Then he sat in the dark in his large house in his expensive chair, wearing a coat that smelled like someone else's world, and a tooth that belonged to a child who had walked toward a stranger and asked for help because no one else would listen. The snow continued to fall outside. It covered the merchant quarter and the Greyward equally, filling the streets and softening the edges and making everything for one night look the same. But Varen knew it would melt by morning. It always did. And when it did, the streets would be different again. Stone on one side, dirt on the other, and the distance between them would be visible, undeniable, waiting to be crossed. Or not. The choice, he understood now, had always been there. It had just taken a little girl in a too big coat to show him where the bridge was.